And let's get started. I thought I'd introduce myself first, because I know a lot of you don't know who I am. My name's Karen. I work at MineralCheck. I am the technical advisor there. I've worked in the field of hair analysis since graduating as a nutritional therapist. I have been working in the field now for about 14 years. Gosh, that seems a long time. And it's the one thing that I talk about every day. So I do see a lot of tests and I talk a lot to a lot of practitioners. Most of the practitioners I talk to are nutritional therapists, but I've done a few seminars for homeopaths. And I love that you come at it from a different direction and you have slightly different ideas of how to use it. So hopefully we can bring some of that in today. The company that I work for is MineralCheck. We've actually been working in the UK for 21 years now. We represent the American laboratory, Trace Elements, over here. So if you're in the UK and you want to do hair analysis, Trace Elements will usually recommend that you come to us, which means that you work with somebody in your own time, so that if you want to call up for technical support, you can do. You're only using a stamp when you send something in to us. And we're very quick because we use couriers to take the sample to the States every day. So if you want to register as a practitioner, you can do so on our website, which is mineralcheck.com. And I've just put a little slip up there. You go to MineralCheck, you can register on the site, on the practitioner page, and you just fill in your details and then we can get you registered as a practitioner. So I thought we'd start with a little introduction to hair analysis. It's actually a very old science. It was first used popularly in Victorian England by the police force in London. The police were looking for a way to prove or disprove arsenic poisoning, which was actually quite a common murder method in Victorian England because it was undetectable. And the police discovered that by analysing the hair, they could find out if somebody had been poisoned by arsenic. So it has a very long history and a very commonplace. It was a very accepted science, which I find fascinating today because I talk to some GPs who feel that it's an unproven science, and yet it's been around since Victorian England. And as an aside, MineralCheck actually tests for some hospitals, particularly one in Wales. So why would we use hair as a hair testing method? Why are we going to use it in our clinics? The first thing I'd say is it's a very safe, non-invasive test. It will measure the levels of the nutrients and also give you an opportunity to look at the ratios of how they match with each other. And we're going to cover the ratios in quite a bit of detail as we go today. But primarily, it's safe, it's non-invasive, and it's very easy to do. It provides a general overview of a person, their health, their adrenal status, their mineral balance, hormones, digestion. One thing I would stress is that it is a screening test. It's not diagnostic of anything, okay? It is a screening test. So it's not an assessment of the body, but of the hair. But from knowing what's going on in the hair, we can infer what might be going on in the body. There are other methods of testing mineral balance. We could look at urine testing, for example. That has to be done over a 24-hour period. So all the urine is collected over 24 hours, which is very inconvenient. And with urine testing, we look at losses from the body, not what is being stored, and overall balancing. So not as efficient and not as effective. Another option we could look at for the body is blood testing. With blood, we have a very narrow homeostatic balance. Something like calcium or potassium is held within a very tight band. If the element like potassium moves out of that very tight band, then respiratory distress will occur. If we take something like calcium, again, the body has a very strong homeostatic balance. And so the body will hold that calcium within a very, very narrow parameter, and it will only rise if there is an extreme pathology present. So something like perhaps a parathyroid tumour. If we look at calcium in the blood in a case of osteoporosis, if we look at the blood of a 12-year-old female, we'll see that the calcium is one level. If we looked again when she's, say, in her 70s, the blood calcium level will still be identical. And that's because the body holds that calcium in a very narrow range, unless, as I say, a pathology is present. The blood will draw calcium from the bones in order to keep that in a very tight band. So blood testing has its place, but for a lot of the minerals, it is a very inefficient method. I would use blood testing in clinic, and I'm a nutritional therapist. I might use blood testing in clinic if I want to look at the B vitamins, because there's no other way of looking at those to find out how the body is using its B vitamins. But for anything else, blood testing is really not an efficient or effective method for the kinds of things that we're looking at in our clinics. So that brings us on to tissue testing, which is the method that we're going to be talking about today. There is a very good correlation between the body tissues and the hair. But when we test the hair, we're just making inference of what else is going on in the body. With a hair test, we're looking at the minerals that have been deposited in the hair over the last 2 to 3 months. And I put this next slide in because I think this is a really lovely slide. It's a very old study. It was done in 1972. And animals were given 300 parts per million of cadmium in their drinking water. And over a 12-week period, they would have an average intake of about 4.5 milligrams. And it's quite a large herd of cows. And what they actually did was they took biopsies of the liver and the kidneys and measured the cadmium in that and compared it with the level of cadmium found in the hair. And what they found was that peak levels were reached in the liver, the kidneys and the hair in 4 weeks. But, and the really interesting thing is, the blood levels remained consistently low despite the fact that the cows were having a continuous exposure to the cadmium. And the blood levels did not correlate at all with the cadmium that was being found in the liver and the kidneys. From this study, we can therefore conclude that hair is a really quite good indication of what is going on in the body with the toxic elements, but that the blood is not so. And the reason for that is that the body is a very effective cleaning method for the blood. The cadmium comes in and the body moves it into storage quite quickly. It doesn't allow it to keep circulating. As it's moved into the tissues, it becomes you get the pattern appearing in the hair, and I will cover that a little bit later. Sorry, just jumping about a little bit there on the slides. So I put here about bearing in mind that this is a screening tool. And I know that some people will say that you can diagnose food intolerances or parasites from a hair sample. And I put this here because if you look on the internet, this comes up at the top. And what I really want to show is that it is not possible in a laboratory test to diagnose food intolerances from a hair sample. And it is not possible to diagnose parasites from a hair sample. You can get clues. You can get clues that someone might have a parasite present. You can get clues that there might be a food intolerance present. And we'll cover some of those when we're looking at the ratios. But you cannot diagnose that at all. That's a little bit of hocus pocus, really. I know it appears, and people do ask me a lot about it. So whenever I do lectures or talks, I always stress, no. For the food intolerances, you need a blood sample. And for parasites, you need a stool sample. But with the hair test, you might get some clues. I just put a little bit here about costs and turnaround time. If you do the graph only, it's £33 to you as practitioners, £59 to as a retail price. And then we also do a test with an interpretation report, and that's £39 to you as practitioners and £69. If you are outside of the UK, because we're a UK-based company only, then there are a couple of other companies that you might want to investigate. If you're in Germany, and I know we had a couple of people from Germany register for the webinar, then I would look at Verisana. If you are in Australia, and I know we had a couple of Australians who are interested, so if you're in Australia, look at Interclinical, and if you're an American, then Trace Elements. If you need any of the contact details for Verisana, Interclinical, or Trace Elements, just drop me an email at the end. My email will appear, just let me know, and then I can forward them to you. So what I want to do now is to look at how you actually take a hair sample. And here we have a little slide of how the hair sample is growing. Under the scalp, the hair surface is exposed to the blood, the lymph, the intracellular fluids, and the internal environment. And as that hair shaft hardens and protrudes from the scalp, you get the evidence of the metabolic pattern being preserved. As an aside, it's that metabolic environment being preserved on the hair shaft that allows some laboratories to look at drug intake or even alcohol intake. I know there is one state where if one's caught driving under the influence of alcohol, it's a state in the US, you are offered an option of the fine or custodial sentence, depending upon the extent of your alcohol intake, or total abstinence, and you just submit a hair sample so that it can be checked for alcohol metabolic sites. Oh, staggered over that word. And also, this is actually how, with drug testing, for example, airlines will routinely test their staff to make sure there is no evidence of recreational drug use. And it's the same thing. Underneath the scalp, the metabolic pattern is being preserved in the hair. And as the shaft hardens and grows out, we can actually look at what's going on. As a laboratory, all we are actually testing are the mineral levels. So we take the sample, ideally from the head. From the back of the head is about 4 centimeters long. I put a little note here about using clean scissors. It's kind of obvious, but we always state the obvious. A scalp sample is ideal. It is possible to use nails or pubic hair or chest hair. So we can use other options, but they do have their disadvantages. The head hair grows continually. Other hair, like pubic hair, grows to a certain length, hangs around for a while, and then drops out. So if you were to test pubic hair, you wouldn't know how old the pattern is. By using head hair, we're getting a recent pattern, and that's really important when we're working with someone in clinic. If someone is completely bald and there is no other option but to test something like pubic hair or chest hair or even the fingernails, which we can do, then I will go ahead and test that, but I would be very cautious and I would only use the results of that to really have a quick look at the overall balance as kind of a very fuzzy snapshot of what might be going on, and very specifically to look at it for toxic elements. For anything else, I do not think that those samples are as accurate. So here we have a little sample going off to the lab. As you can see, it's about 4 centimeters long. It's just loose. It's going straight in the envelope to go to the laboratory. When we consider the hair as a sample, I do get asked a lot about what external influences might affect the sample. And there are a few things that do affect it. For example, one does tend to be asked about dyes, highlighting, and shampoos. Now, and even perming. So let's look at those. The perm solution, the relaxant, uses magnesium. So if someone has permed hair, I always suggest they have to be washed as a few times to make sure all of the relaxant has been removed. If they have used a shampoo, most shampoos do not affect the hair sample. We did one study in the Trace Elements laboratory where a number of volunteers had their hair analysed before and after washing their hair. And what we found with the shampoos was that they really didn't make any difference. are very, very negligible. Really, the shampoo is not on the hair long enough. There is just one shampoo that will affect the hair, and that is an anti-dandruff shampoo. Some anti-dandruff shampoos use zinc in them, and some use selenium. So if I'm going to take a sample from someone, I always ask if they're using an anti-dandruff shampoo, and if they are, ask them to switch to a gentle baby shampoo for a few washes. And then the question comes up about dyes and highlighting. And most women highlight their hair or dye it in some form. I have looked at a lot of samples, and I would say in my own clinic, I regularly test women's hair that is dyed and highlighted. If I didn't, I just simply wouldn't get the test. I do not feel that the highlights and the dyes affect the samples. I have read the research, and I do know that bleaching can affect the sample, but in practice, I rarely see it does. The only dyes that I am particularly careful of are those that blacken the hair, because they can sometimes use something like a lead to create the black effect. And if you see, I put up on the next slide, you blow it up, you can see what a contaminated sample actually looks like. This is Gordon, and his lead level initially was 226.9 milligram%, excessively high. On the retest, he denied dyeing his hair. On the retest, it was 142.4, still an excessively high lead level. And at the retest, the practitioner sat him down and said, this lead level is way too high. What is happening? And it was then he confessed he was actually blackening his hair. Now, got absolutely great question about whether or not the sample needs to be cut as close to the scalp as possible. And yes, it does. What you're really looking for is the most recent pattern. So you want it cut as close to the scalp. You don't want it pulled out. You want it cut so that you don't contaminate it with anything. So that's sort of covering the samples. Mary put in the great question about, does it have to be as close to the scalp as possible? And I've answered that. If you do have any other questions, pop them into the chat box. And as before I move on to the next section, I will actually come back and check on those questions. So looking at the test results, I'll show you what test results look like, how to use those results, and how to get the best from them. So this is just a little sample of the results from MineralCheck. I think a couple of you, like Sarah, will be familiar with it. Others of you maybe won't. You've perhaps seen tests from other laboratories. The interpretation stuff that I'm going to give you will apply to any lab. So here what we're seeing is the first is the blue box, which has the nutrient minerals. Then moving over, we have the little pink box, which shows the toxic elements. And then the box at the bottom is the green one, and that shows the additional elements. These are less common, if you like, and there's a lot less research on them. We report them, and I do know quite a little bit about them, and if you ring in and you've got a really high level of one of them, we might chat about it and talk about how that applies to your client. But in the main, we're looking at the blue box, the nutritional elements, the pink box, the toxic elements, and then the one that's quite exciting, which is the next page, which shows us the nutritional relationships between the minerals. And that's something I really want to cover in the seminar. So we have the little box of the toxic elements. And really, all of these are going to show what the toxics are. And here we can see that this person has mercury. It is a retest. So their mercury level here is in the pale pink. So it's well above what we would normally expect to find. And they've also got arsenic showing and aluminium showing as well. So those will start to give us a picture of their toxicity. And we can balance that against the nutritional minerals, which we're looking at here in this box, where we can see a very elevated calcium and then quite low levels of magnesium, sodium, potassium, and elevated copper. A zinc, excellent level of zinc, bang on the reference range, low phosphorus, excellent iron, bang in the middle of where we want it to be, low manganese, a little bit low on the chromium, very low selenium, low boron, low cobalt, molybdenum, and a very low sulfur level. And so we need to have a look at those and work out what we're going to do, both from a nutritional perspective and also from your point of view as a homeopath. This might start to give you some clues and feed into the picture you're building of your patient. Each of the reports comes with the graph, obviously, showing results, and then the interpretation report. And that will give dietary advice, it will give explanations, and it will give a supplement protocol. And there are two parts to that. There is the report for you, the practitioner, which gives a lot more detail, and then a part for your client, which will talk about the dietary advice that they should be following. It backs up a lot of what you might have said and gives you more information. So when we're using the test in practice, what do we get? Well, first of all, we're going to look at, we've got the mineral levels, and you've already seen a little bit of how the mineral levels show and the toxic elements. We can't test for the vitamins. Vitamins don't test out in the hair. But what we can look at, we can make some assumptions. So if we were to see a very low magnesium level, we would know the person needed magnesium. But we would also know that they need B6 because the B6 is essential to get the magnesium properly utilised. So they go hand in hand. And we always explain that in the reports. We'll also be able to look at a little bit about the adrenals, the thyroid function, the immune system, their state of mind. So there's a lot there that we can start to look at in our clinics. Before we go on to talk about how we can interpret the results and the ratios, I want to talk a little about what they are. First of all, as a laboratory, we present our results in milligram%. Some laboratories do it in parts per million. I think milligram% is nicer. It's a smaller number. If we looked at something like a calcium level of 1,630 parts per million, we could also explain that as 163 milligram%. Smaller number, so nice and easy to look at. So if you are looking at another laboratory's results and you want to refer back later to some of these slides, if you've got a lab that's working in parts per million, simply put on. So 180 parts per million is 18 milligram%, and that'll be useful when we're looking at ratios. So how do we get the best out of the results? And this is something that I was actually asked by Sarah to cover, which was the elevated elements. If you are in the UK, you will have seen high calcium. And I find this high calcium fascinating because it appears on so many of the UK tests. Around 85% of tests in the UK come out with high calcium. If we compare that with, say, Scandinavia, only 51% of those have high calcium. So that's really interesting. And what it means is that the calcium is elevated. Always look at it alongside potassium. And it's either elevated by itself or it might be in the reference range, but there might be no potassium. So it's elevated relative to the potassium. And what that means is there's a lot of calcium present, but is not available to the body. So we would say it was bio-unavailable. It's present, but it cannot be used. And this is usually due to a number of reasons, perhaps a lack of various nutrients, maybe a deficiency of them. But the calcium is present, it's bio-unavailable, the body can't use it, and therefore what it will do is it will store the excess in the soft tissues, such as the joints, the lymph nodes maybe, or the arteries. Very often when we start working with people and we get the calcium being correctly utilized, they'll report a lessening of joint pain, for example. So why does that calcium elevate? There are a number of reasons, and I think each of them are worth looking at, and I'm covering it in detail because it's so common here in the UK. The calcium elevates. Either part one is because there is not sufficient magnesium or manganese present. Magnesium is one of the hardest elements to get into the diet, partly because we use it up so much. There's an abundance of magnesium in things like leafy green vegetables. People don't often eat enough of them, but we also use it up very, very quickly. So we might have low magnesium, high calcium. So we've got that ratio going on. So magnesium or manganese become part of the picture. Oh, I've skipped through a few slides there. I didn't mean to do that, sorry. The other reason that calcium might elevate is a lack of the vitamins C, E, and B6, or even all three of them. So if we see elevated calcium, I would be considering whether or not somebody needs vitamin B6, which they will if they have the low magnesium, vitamin C, and vitamin E. And I also wanted to cover a little bit there about vitamin D, because we think a lot about vitamin D shortage and how people do need their vitamin D. One of the issues with vitamin D is that vitamin D promotes the renal absorption of calcium. So we get a test back, we see high calcium, and we start to work on it, perhaps with magnesium, perhaps with vitamin C, vitamin E. If the person is taking vitamin D, the calcium that we mobilize, the body will try to excrete, and the vitamin D will promote the reabsorption of that. So you create this cycle. And that's something that you want to be careful of. And my solution to that, particularly in the summer months, is not to use supplemental vitamin D, but to encourage somebody to get out in the sun. Let the body make any vitamin D it needs. The body will make what it needs. It won't make an excess of it. And so the body will naturally balance that out. A couple of other reasons that calcium may elevate would be a lack of protein in the diet, or a protein metabolism error, which would mean they're not taking in enough HCl, hydrochloric acid. So always consider the diet, consider whether or not they're eating enough protein, and whether they can digest that protein appropriately. And then also consider thyroid function. And we will cover thyroid function a little bit later. But again, I just want to bring it in here because it is one of the reasons why the calcium may elevate. The thyroid controls the calcium going into the bones. If the thyroid is underfunctioning, then that control will not happen and the calcium will start to elevate in the body. The other element that turns up quite a lot as elevated is copper. And the copper imbalance is a major pattern on hair analysis. Again, like the calcium, what it means is that the copper is present, but is not available to be used. So to be available, the copper has to be bound to a blood protein and it has to be accessible. If the copper is elevated, there are a number of reasons that is not happening. And we will be covering that a little bit later when we look at the zinc and copper ratio. So that lets us move on to the significant ratios. So the first thing I want to cover is what a ratio actually is. So we're talking about the significant ratio, but we want to be clear that we understand what a significant ratio is. And what a ratio is the comparison of one mineral to another. And we work out the ratio by dividing the level of one mineral by the level of another. So if we have a calcium level of 60 and a magnesium level of 5, 60 divided by 5 is 12. And that means we have a ratio of 12 to 1. That means that we have 12 parts of calcium for every 1 of magnesium. Ideally, the ratio we would really want to be looking at is 7. So in this case, as an example, we've got more calcium than we actually need to balance the magnesium. So that's just a little bit about what a ratio actually is. And I'm going to move on to look at a number of the significant ratios and talk about what they actually mean. And I'm hoping by talking about what they actually mean, that will start to give you clues about how, when you've got a set of results in front of you in your clinic, you can use those to work with your patients. So the first ratio I want to look at is the calcium to phosphorus ratio. And this is called the metabolic ratio. We will use this to assess metabolism, oxidation. It simply means, when we talk about oxidation, the rate at which food is burned for energy. And this ratio in particular accounts for things like the fast metabolic type and the slow metabolic type that you do see on a hair analysis. Just as an aside, I would also look at this when I'm thinking about bone formation, because we need a good relationship between calcium and phosphorus for the formation of bone. And so it's a better guide to thinking about how a person might be making and laying down bone, particularly relevant with perhaps middle-aged women. It's a good guide for how they are laying down their bone and the future of their bone health. The reason we can look at this for the metabolic ratio is that calcium is quite sedating and phosphorus is exciting. And what that means is that the minerals have a different effect on the body. Some are quite sedative, some are quite stimulating. And so calcium sedates, phosphorus excites. And by looking at the ratio between the two, we start to get a clue of the metabolic types. And I've put in, oh wait a minute, there's a question here. Is excess copper because it's biounavailable, or is too much built up from environmental overexposure? Mike, that's a great question. I'm going to hang on to that one and come back to it when we talk about copper, because yeah, I'm going to cover that hopefully more, but if I don't, give me a nudge later on. I just want to cover a little bit. I put 2 slides in here on the metabolic type. This is quite a complex issue. And very simply, it has a really fun part of the roots. Back in 1972, Dr. Watson found that he could predict how people would respond to the smell of raw liver. They would either love it or hate it. And that was the fun side. And he went on to develop his research, and he identified 3 types of oxidizers: fast, slow, and mixed. And he used a number of tests to determine that. Hair mineral analysis researchers began to plot their results on a graph, and they laid Watson's findings on top of it and found that they could actually predict the metabolic type from the mineral levels. And so the way I think of this is a framework, and it's a framework into which you can plug other information about the client. So if I see someone is a fast 1 type, I know that that's a very balanced response. I know their adrenals and thyroid are outputting excessively, but it's a synchronized, balanced response for them. And that's okay. And then the others give you an indication of what might be going on. So fast 2, we'd have increased adrenal, reduced thyroid function. So we'd start to see energy fluctuations. We'd start to see mood swings coming in. It's just a framework. It gives you a little bit of information. And I popped in 2 slides there, one on the fast and the other on the slow metabolic type, because I think that might be quite useful for you at a later stage if you're using the test. It links very much with Seeley's resistance stress cycle, the various 4 stages of stress, where we have a good response, we start to get exhausted, we start to get resistance creeping in, then we get exhaustion, and we can move around those stress cycles. Somebody is, as a rule, either a fast or a slow metabolic type. Neither one is better than the other. They just are. And what you're looking for is to get somebody as balanced as possible within their metabolic type. So that leads us on to the calcium-magnesium ratio. I always call this one the blood sugar ratio, because we see quite an imbalance on this when somebody is craving sugars. We need a stable level of blood sugar if somebody is experiencing the swings, the peaks, and the troughs, craving sugar, craving caffeine, feeling really energetic 1 minute, exhausted the next. They will have an imbalance in this ratio. And it's partly because the pancreas releases its insulin, and that release is dependent on calcium. And it's inhibited by magnesium. So ideally, we'd be looking at a ratio of 7 to 1, 7 parts of calcium, 1 to magnesium. The higher the level of calcium to magnesium, the more imbalanced their blood sugar is going to be. Can look at sodium and potassium. This is really where we start to look at vitality and the adrenals. The adrenals regulate sodium and potassium. Usually when sodium is elevated, so high, potassium will also be elevated. A slow metabolic type will usually have low sodium and low potassium. And we can get a clue about stress levels here. If the ratio, which ideally would be 2.4 to 1, is over 5 to 1, then so that would mean we've got maybe, say, 7 to 1 as a ratio, 7 parts of sodium to 1 of potassium. What that would mean is that they are in an acute stress reaction. And if the ratio is lower than 1.5, they're exhausted. And a sodium-potassium ratio of 1, so 1 part sodium, 1 part potassium, is actually quite common, and it will show that someone is the exhausted stage of stress. So when you're thinking about therapeutic interventions, supporting the stress response would be a key into moving them back towards their health. Alongside that ratio, we would also look at sodium magnesium. Again, here, if we have low sodium, low magnesium, we're looking at exhausted stage of stress. High sodium, high magnesium, we're looking at actually resistance to stress. So it's giving us a stress picture. And it's quite an efficient way of doing it and a very cost-effective way of doing it. And then when we've considered the adrenal glands, we also want to think about the thyroid and how the thyroid is functioning. And for that, we can look at calcium and potassium. This is a really simple ratio to read. If it's high, the person is hypothyroid. If it is low, they're hyper. So anything less than 4, they're trending towards hypothyroid. And I would look at that alongside selenium. But what we're looking at, the reason we're using potassium initially here, is that potassium helps the body pick up the thyroid hormone. Potassium also helps the body pick up the adrenal hormones. So I think of potassium as like the key that takes the adrenal and the thyroid hormones across the cell wall. If you have insufficient potassium, then the thyroid and the adrenal hormones can't get in. So potassium is key to help the body pick up the thyroid hormone in particular. And I'd look at this ratio alongside selenium, because selenium is absolutely key to thyroid function. If there is not enough selenium, then the thyroid hormone cannot be released. There's a lovely study that was done in Australia. And what they did was they gave somebody they had quite a big group, and they gave people 2 Brazil nuts. So 59 people in the group. They gave them divided them into 3 groups. One group had 100 micrograms of selenium, and it was good selenium supplement. One group had 2 Brazil nuts a day, and the other group had a dummy pill. And what they found was that the Brazil nuts were as effective as selenium supplements at increasing the level of glutathione peroxidase in the blood. They measured the glutathione peroxidase every 2 weeks, and they found the Brazil nuts were as effective as selenium supplements. And I think that's a lovely study, because if we see low selenium, then we can, and we're thinking about thyroid function, we can put in some Brazil nuts, which is a nice food intervention. 2 to 6 Brazil nuts every morning with breakfast is something that's quite easy for people to do. So it's quite a nice little foodie trick that you can use there to get selenium up. And so we move on to the zinc and copper ratio. And here we're looking at a balance between the two for optimal health. Estrogen is very closely associated with copper. When one rises, as a rule, the other will be rising as well. This is partly because estrogen is detoxified in the same pathway in the liver as the copper. And so if we have an excess of one, it starts to block the pathway. I described this recently to somebody as it's like a lot of traffic in 2 lanes coming into one. Then we get a backlog. The body can't deal with the backlog, so it starts to reabsorb it. So we get reabsorbing of copper and reabsorbing of the estrogen. Alongside that, zinc is associated with progesterone in females. So the zinc-copper ratio can give us a clue. If we have a ratio, we ideally are looking at 8 to 1. If we had a ratio of 20 to 1, then we would know we have way too much of the zinc, and so we'd start to think about progesterone levels. Interestingly, a low zinc to copper ratio is an environment which encourages yeast and fungal proliferation. And so if we have a lot of copper and not so much zinc, we can start to think that yeasts or fungal overgrowths may be implicated in the health picture. I'll put a little slide here that low zinc to copper is actually quite common in women with PMS. And there are some very specific indications of elevated estrogen, which you can see on the slide. The other thing when this ratio is very low is I might be thinking about whether or not somebody is eating sufficient protein. And so, Mike, we're kind of starting to come back to the excess copper. Yeah, it is biounavailable. It probably hasn't built up from environment. It has probably built up from the internal environment. And I think we're going to cover that slightly more. It's simply that the copper is now biounavailable. The body can't use it. And where it came from is going to be different for a lot of people, but there are some clues. So we start to see how maybe the copper was related, for example, to estrogen. But it also might be linked with the iron use. A high ratio of iron to copper would suggest that the body is storing rather than using the iron. You might actually get anemia shown even though there is a good level of iron if the iron is being blocked either by copper or perhaps by aluminium. If the ratio is high, we can also consider that there might be a bacterial infection present. That would be because very high iron indicates there is a bacterial infection because bacteria feed on iron. So the body withholds the iron from the blood. It has to store it. So we're back to it's biounavailable. The body doesn't want the iron circulating because the bacteria will feed upon it. If I see an elevated iron level and the person doesn't think they have had a bacterial infection, then there are two places that bacteria reside that people are commonly unaware of it. The first one is in the mouth, and then the second is in the gut. So start to think about whether or not they need to visit a dental hygienist, which is a very quick way of sorting out bacteria in the mouth, if it's underneath the gum pockets, and maybe whether or not perhaps probiotics are needed to help improve gut health. The other thing we find is that copper is very often elevated with thyroid insufficiency. And that brings us back to the fact that copper is a major pattern on hair analysis, this high copper. It's something we see a lot of. It may suggest that there's a problem detoxifying estrogen. It is also related to the dopamine, adrenaline, noradrenaline pathways. High copper level will stimulate the amines, so we'll get a lot of adrenaline floating around. And we need the copper to break down or to make monoamine oxidase, which breaks down the high copper. So we have a lot of copper stimulating the amines, and we need to make sure it's bioavailable to actually get that copper broken down. If we have a high level of copper showing, we may be thinking about whether or not there's candida present or fungal overgrowth in the gut. High copper is very, very common in these cases. It's common to see a high copper level in part because the gut bacteria like a high copper environment. And we don't really know how they do it, but they actually seem to be able to promote that high copper environment and hang on to it in order to protect their environment. So that's something that I would think about if I'm starting to see high copper. I know it's biounavailable, but I'm also thinking about why it's there and whether or not we perhaps need to put in probiotics to get the copper down. And as homeopaths, I know that you have got some great copper detoxification tools that you can use alongside that. The issue, I think, in detoxifying copper is to make sure that you also address whether or not there's something going on in the gut. Otherwise, it's like a little bit like mowing the lawn. You can get rid of the copper, but the roots stay there, and it will just regrow or redevelop and then come back and back and back and start to rise and rise and rise. Copper has to be bound to a blood protein to be bioavailable. And I actually thought that there was a slide on that, but I didn't put it in. So I'm going to explain it. Copper has to be bound to a blood protein called mental blank on that one. Okay, let's just go with copper has to be bound to a blood protein and seroplasmin. There we go, the mental process kick back in. Copper is bound to seroplasmin in the blood, but the body can only make seroplasmin in the liver if it gets the signal to do so from the adrenals. If the adrenals are under-functioning, they will only do the key things they need to do. So they might not send that signal to the liver. So the copper will continue to rise. Copper then inhibits the adrenal function. So it has a suppressing effect on the adrenals. So they send less of the signals to the liver. So the body will make less of the blood protein it needs. And so we get this circle appearing where the copper can continue to rise until we do some kind of intervention. So I think high copper is quite interesting. And I hope, Mike, that's kind of answered a lot more of what you were thinking about when you asked your question about biounavailability in copper. It's a complex issue, and we need to think about how to get the copper utilised correctly. And that can involve supporting the adrenals, supporting the liver, supporting the thyroid function, as well as just detoxing the copper itself. So we've got a little bit of time, and I very briefly want to cover the toxic elements as well. These really are a huge topic, and I'm going to look at doing some more webinars simply on the toxic elements. So that might be something to keep an eye out for. In brief, as a report, we test for a number of the toxics. We test for aluminium, uranium, beryllium, cadmium, antimony, arsenic, mercury, and lead. Everyone has a toxic element. It's just not possible not to have any. You might have them locked up in storage, but as a rule, you'll always see a toxic element on a test. And this is a very typical of the pattern that we'd see. A little bit of arsenic, some mercury, and some aluminium. And when working with the toxic elements, one high element might be a problem. So if we slip back to this, we can see that the mercury is high. That might be a problem. There are lots and lots of health issues that can be tied up to mercury. 5 minutes on PubMed, we can find some research papers that will tie mercury into a health issue, whatever it will be. So if we look at this one chart alone, we can see that there's high mercury, might be the problem. But there's also a fiddly bit of arsenic, a touch of uranium, a touch of cadmium, and some aluminium present. One of them being high might be the issue, but there's also the compound effect. Shouldn't be underestimated. When we're working out the toxic dose of an element, researchers will feed it to rats, and they'll take 100 rats. And the dose of mercury, for example, that kills all 100 rats is the toxic dose. And the dose that just killed one is considered insignificant. We could express that as 1 over 100. If the same researchers then repeat the experiment with lead and give some lead to rats, and they work out the toxic dose, and they work out the amount of lead that kills just 1 in 100, and then they give to another 100 rats the amount of 1 in 100, the amount of mercury that killed 1 in 100 rats, and the amount of lead that killed 1 in 100 rats. So give the two together, that amount will kill all 100 in research. So what we learn from that is that the compound effect is actually much, much higher than one might consider. So if we go back to that little graph that I popped up, we can see there's a tiny amount of uranium, might consider it insignificant, a tiny amount of arsenic, again we might be thinking it's insignificant, a tiny amount of cadmium could well be insignificant. But the compound effect of those three, alongside the mercury, alongside the aluminium, may actually be quite significant in impacting on someone's health. So I don't really have time to cover each of the toxic elements. So I thought what I would do is just cover some general comments about the toxicity. So my general advice, first of all, can I find where the element has come from? Now, very often the answer to that is no. These have a long shelf life in the body. So you could be looking at a childhood exposure. These elements are absolutely everywhere in our environment, so they're very easy to take on board. So if you have an easy one, like a builder that's chewing a pencil and is high in lead, that's a bit of a gift. You just stop them chewing their pencil, you reduce their intake. But very often you can't find the source. So you start to think about, well, we can't find the source, but what do we do? And that's where I would say we rebalance the nutritional minerals. First thing, start to look at what you can do nutritionally. Improve the diet, work on supporting the nutrition, and also support the adrenals. Do not underestimate the stress on the body of a toxic element. And give liver support. The element will be cleared through the liver or the kidneys, and it will be cleared through via the nutritional elements you're giving. And so we'll be thinking about things like good bowel function, make sure they're drinking plenty of water, the absolute basics, and then how either nutritionally or homeopathically you support the adrenals and the liver. As a nutritional therapist, I would start to give the antagonists. So for example, I know that magnesium antagonizes lead. So I might want to get someone's magnesium status as good as I can, because that will help lower the lead level. That's how I would be thinking. I know homeopathically you might be thinking slightly differently, which is fine. There's lots of ways to get to the same result. I also think a little bit about detoxifying food. There is some great research on the element, the food coriander. Coriander leaf can be really, really helpful in removing toxic elements. So whenever I see a toxic element and I start to work with somebody, I'll get them to put as much leaf coriander into their diet. I'll think about high sulfur foods like garlic and onions. Apples, the pectin in apples is great for detoxifying. Lentils, they are excellent foods. Mung beans, pulses, anything like that. Eggs, again, a good source of sulfur. So I'll put in as many good foods as I can into the diet as well. Just popped in a little chart there. Recap how the picture works. With this one, we can see that we've got two quite high toxic elements. We've got a very elevated calcium picture. And so here we'd be thinking about biounavailable calcium and detoxifying those toxic elements. Little slide on how we work, on the costs, and that sort of covers the end of that section on the toxic elements. And what I'd like to say is throw it open, actually. We've got the little chat box at the bottom. Thanks for listening, thanks for watching, and do you have any questions? I can see someone's typing a question, so that's great. Oh, that's an interesting question, Sarah. Can I briefly mention my thoughts on the body holding on to toxic metals and then detoxifying them following treatment? Not quite sure what you're getting onto there. I think the reason the body holds on to a toxic element is because it's not in a position to remove it. I'm aware sometimes I make this sound quite anthropomorphic, but it's an easy way to explain it. The body ingested the toxic element. The way we are designed to work long before, in our natural state, if you like, before the 21st century kicked in. We're designed to come into toxic elements all the time and just remove them. That's supposed to happen. So in some people it doesn't, and the question has to be why. There is some great research done on plants growing on the M25. And bear with me. The plants on the M25, plants grow in the soil. The soil is incredibly high in aluminium. It is the most abundant element in the Earth's substrate. But the plants don't absorb the aluminium. That is why we can eat them. Now, the research, which was done by Dr. Neil Ward at the University of Surrey, showed that in a really high stress and high polluted environment, those plants started to absorb the aluminium. So their protective mechanism failed. Now, this is just my theory, but my theory may be that actually, as humans, we're designed to come into toxic elements and remove them, just like those plants were. Maybe in a high-stressed environment, poor nutrition, poor lifestyle choices, traumatic stress, anything like that, our mechanism to detoxify those elements easily starts to fail. And this ties up with something that I've read on aluminium. In order to move around the body, aluminium has to sit on its transport protein. The transport protein is actually designed to carry iron. And I kind of picture it as a little flying saucer with iron in the middle of it, and it whizzes around the body. If there's not enough iron, the body will move the next chemically similar thing, which is aluminium. And so the body gives the blood protein free access. Anywhere where it should stop the aluminium, it actually doesn't, because it recognizes the surrounding protein and it allows it in. And so the body is now, if you like, its mechanism to avoid the aluminium is compromised. So I think it's that our lives today can put us in a position where we start to absorb them. I don't think that we hold on to them so much. I think that we just don't have the ability to then detoxify them out. And I think that's where the therapeutic intervention comes in. And that's where they start to be detoxed, because we come in as therapists, we improve the diet, we start to support the adrenals, we start to support the liver, we talk to people about lifestyle choices, we move them back to a healthier position, and then I'm going back to my anthropomorphic state, the body goes, oh, that's great, and starts to chuck things out. So it starts to remove the toxic elements. I answered that in a very long-winded way, Sarah, but I hope that got to the base of your question. A question, and does the test result give results for bromium and fluoride as well? No, it doesn't. What's the best way to detox copper, bromium, and fluoride? Oh, a big question. The best way to detox copper, go back to what I was saying about detoxing any of the toxic elements. Think about adrenal function. We need to get the body making its copper binding transport protein. So we need good adrenal function. Without the adrenal function, we won't get that copper binding transport made. So we need those adrenals functioning at full pelt. We need good liver function. So we need to take the pressure off the liver as much as possible so the liver can do its job. That means sorting out the blood sugar balance. That means eating good food. It means lots of antioxidants going in. It means lots of water. So those are really simple, lifey things that we can do. I suppose supporting the adrenals is not really simple, but we might use glandulars homeopathically. You have lots of tools for supporting someone's stress response. I would also look at then the antagonists. So, and it would be different for every case. I would look at their nutritional elements. Do they need vitamin C? Do they need vitamin E? Do they need vitamin B6? Vitamin C is a really strong copper antagonist, as is vitamin B3. Do they need chromium? That's a really good copper antagonist. Zinc is excellent for antagonizing copper in the gut. Magnesium is very helpful. So I'd look at their nutritional elements as well. Rita's question. If you are trying to balance using a supplement, how long before you see an improvement for a retest? Is it a minimum of a month, 2 months? Or can some people already start to announce it in a week? How long do I tell a patient to take a supplement for? Great question, Rita. How long to take a supplement for? I would say a minimum of 3 months. Somebody may feel better within a few days. Other people may feel better within a month, and other people within a couple of months. But I always think it takes a minimum of 3 months to actually start to have an effect. Somebody may feel better, but you won't actually remove the elements. In terms of a retest, I would always suggest to people that they retest according to what they do. Now, it sounds a little bit odd, but if somebody comes into your clinic, does the test, and goes away fired up with enthusiasm, they take your homeopathic remedies, they take nutritional supplements, they put lifestyle interventions into place, we in 3 months. If they come in and they're a little bit more cautious, maybe take 1 or 2 supplements, kind of take the remedy, half-heartedly start to change things, you might want to leave it 5 months. If they only do 1 or 2 things, you might want to leave it 6 or 7 months. So I would make my retesting intervention fit according to how much they do. So 3 months is about the minimum, I think. After that, if they have done, and that's for someone who's motivated and done a fairly good protocol throughout. So I would, Rita, always suggest 3 months is the minimum for someone taking supplements. Leslie has asked, yes, Leslie, if you came in late, don't worry, I will have the slides sent to you. That's fine. Yes, Sarah, all right, I will mention. Sarah has put a little nudge here. Sarah knows that I'm writing a pamphlet or a little booklet, which is just finished with the designers. I'm just finishing the proofreading now. I've written a book to back up a lot of what I talk about at lectures and webinars, and I talk to practitioners about when they phone in for advice. And I've written a booklet, and if you're interested in a copy, that will be available to you. So yes, I will send that out to you. If you want one, just let me know. Gonzala, any idea if a copper IUD affects copper levels? Absolutely, yes. A copper level does affect, a copper IUD will affect copper levels, as does the pill and HRT. So anything that is estrogenic, so even an estrogenic IUD will affect copper levels, and a copper IUD definitely. You can actually detox copper with the copper IUD still in place. It isn't a case of saying, okay, you have high copper, you have a copper IUD, you must get it removed. But, and here's the big but, you can work to detoxify it, but it's a little bit like emptying the bath with the tap still running. You've still got the copper coming from the IUD, so you will get an improvement, but you won't necessarily remove it entirely. You will get an improvement in people's health responses very, very often. I'm going to put my email and my phone number up in a moment. So if that's the questions, if you've got a couple of questions, fire away. I think that's probably all of them. So I'd just like to thank Sarah. Special thanks to Sarah from everybody, I'm sure, but particularly from me, because it was Sarah who came up with the idea of the webinar, and it was Sarah who encouraged me to come along and give one a go. So thank you, Sarah. If you do want to contact me, you can contact me at MineralCheck. Our website is mineralcheck.com. I've put my phone number there, which is 850 500, and you can email me, Karen@mineralcheck.com. I did email you all to invite you to the seminar, and what I will try and do is I will download the recording and make it available to you. And that's some really kind comments. Thank you so much. That's brilliant. Thank you so much to putting some lovely thank yous and kind comments about the webinar. That's really great. I'm thrilled to have had the opportunity to talk to you all. It was lovely to see you all. And I will follow up with sending you the slides and a copy of the recording. So, and yeah, if you want a copy of the book, we can do that as well. Yes, of course, Sarah, that's absolutely fine to share the slides and your details on your Facebook page. And can you share the recording with people who are interested? Yes, Sarah, send me an invite to the Facebook page. That would be lovely. and you can share the recording. I'm more than happy for you to do that. MineralCheck also has a YouTube channel where I have been putting up, this is the third webinar I've done. They're quite similar, or I cover a lot of the same material, but it might be worth, if you can find just put into Google MineralCheck YouTube, and you'll find the channel, because as the year goes on, I'm doing a couple more on the toxic elements, and you might find those interesting as well. So thank you very much, and goodbye for now.